Hi, I'm Steve Harris, and before I joined OAC Ministries, I studied law and I qualified to become a barrister. And in this video, I just want to try and explain to you very simply what the law is relating to street evangelism in England and Wales, just so that you know what your rights are when you go out to preach the gospel. Now, there may be different restrictions at the moment due to COVID regulations, and I'm not going to discuss those here. What we're looking at here is what the law is in normal times when there aren't extra restrictions put in place for COVID or anything like that. I want to tell you right at the beginning that we have great freedom to preach on the streets. We are able to go out and proclaim the gospel so that people may be saved. The other thing I want to say right at the beginning is that the police aren't out to get us. I've been preaching on the streets in England and Wales, all over the country, for over 12 years, and I have never, ever once been spoken to by a police officer. They'll often walk by as I'm preaching, see what I'm doing, and are more than happy with what I'm doing, and just carry on by. So despite what you might have read or seen, I want to assure you that the police are not out to try and get us. They're not out to try and stop us from exercising our right to go out and preach the gospel. When it comes to a public street, you do not need permission from anybody to preach on that public street. However, there is a slight caveat when we talk about public streets, because nowadays, sometimes things which appear to be public streets aren't, especially around shopping centres where actually they've bought the land, and even though it appears to be public, it's actually private land. And so you have to be careful in some of those areas just to try and ensure that where you are trying to preach is actually a public street. The other place where you have to be slightly cautious is in public parks, because sometimes there may be a bylaw that would be posted at the entrance to the park which says that preaching is prohibited in that place. If there isn't a bylaw posted, then you should be fine to preach in that place because it's a public place, just like a public street. One of the most common questions I get asked when it comes to preaching on the streets is, what if I offend somebody? I want to tell you, you cannot be stopped from preaching because someone listening is offended or upset. However, I want you to remember, though, that it's the gospel that's offensive, not us. The gospel is offensive to people because it says to them that they can't sort out the problem and the situation they're in by themselves, and actually they need God to step in. So the gospel needs to be offensive if we're delivering it clearly and effectively, but we shouldn't be offensive ourselves. God doesn't call us to be offensive, but actually to win people to Christ. There's actually great advice in the Evangelical Alliance's booklet that covers some of this, that I'll put some links in the description to below. And it says in there that if your evangelism is greeted with hostility and provocation, it would be wise to consider how effective it is to continue preaching in that way, in that place, at that time. Sometimes continuing to speak boldly will be the right thing to do. Other times, though, it may be better to vary the tone of what is being said, or offering to have a more private discussion with the bystanders may be the most Christ-like way to respond. And so we can't be stopped for being offensive, but we need to think about whether being offensive is the most effective way to share the gospel. When it comes to the criminal law, the case which covers this area is Redmond Bate versus the Director of Public Prosecutions from 1999. In this case, the defendant refused to stop preaching when asked to do so by the police. The police feared that there was going to be a breach of the peace, and so they charged him with obstructing a police officer in the execution of his duty. However, when it went to court, the judge looked at what had happened and said this: if the threat of disorder or violence was coming from passers-by who were taking the opportunity to react so as to cause trouble, then it was they and not the preachers who should be asked to desist and arrested if they would not. The judge laid out three things to consider. He said you need to consider, is there an imminent threat? Is there something that is going to cause a breach of the peace? Where is that threat coming from? Is that threat coming from the preacher, or is it coming from the crowd? And actually, that it's the person that's causing the threat should be the one that's stopped. And are you pursuing lawful conduct? Which, by going out onto the streets and preaching the gospel, we are pursuing lawful conduct, and therefore it's not us, but those that perhaps try to stop us or violently stand against us that should be stopped in the case of the criminal law. When it comes to the civil law, the main thing that we need to think about is obstruction. One of my fellow evangelists in OAC Ministries tells of a story of many years ago when he was preaching the gospel on the streets, and a policeman came up to him and said, "Sir, you're going to have to stop because you're causing an obstruction." And he said, "I'm not causing an obstruction, officer. I'm just preaching the gospel. I have a right to do this." And the officer pointed out to him, he said, "Look, you see, right the way over there where the shops start, your crowd starts there. And if you follow your crowd all the way around, they get all the way around to the shops on the other side of the street. There isn't a single place for people to get past. You've drawn such a big crowd that actually no one can get past." And the evangelist had to say, "Fair enough, officer. I guess I am causing an obstruction." Now, it would be wonderful if we were drawing crowds like that, amazing crowds to hear the gospel, but actually we would still need to be careful that we're not actually falling foul of the civil law of obstruction. And the civil law of obstruction from the Highways Act 1980, section 137 says this: "If a person willfully obstructs the free passage along the highway, he is guilty of an offense." But when thinking about obstruction, it's necessary to think about the reasonableness of the obstruction. So thinking about the duration of the obstruction. If you've just stopped briefly in the street to have a conversation, then you're not going to be causing an obstruction because there's going to be no duration to that. However, if you've set up a place ready to preach and you're blocking the street and causing an obstruction, and you're going to be there for a length of time, that would cause a problem. The position of the obstruction. This is why often when we go out as OAC Ministries, we'll set up our sketchboard or whatever we have with us up against a lamppost or a post or something like that, something that is already a natural obstruction in the street, and so therefore we're not causing an extra obstruction, but just fitting in with the street furniture that's there. You also need to think about the purpose of the meeting, which, as we've talked about all along, preaching on the streets is a lawful meeting, and so therefore that is okay, provided that we don't fall foul of the others in causing an obstruction. And then the last thing that needs to be considered is, was it an actual obstruction or a potential obstruction? As in the case of the story I just told, it actually ended up being an actual obstruction. Whereas if you just set up ready to preach and the police tried to stop you before any crowd had come, then you would be able to say, well, actually, this isn't an actual obstruction. You're just thinking about a potential obstruction. However, you do need to think about where you set up. If you've set up on a tiny little footpath on the side of the street where only one person can pass by another person, barely as it is, and you've set up by there and are blocking the whole thing, then you probably are causing an obstruction. It's much better to try and set up in an area which is wide and open so that you won't fall foul of causing an obstruction. What about giving out literature? Well, the Clean Neighborhoods and Environments Act from 2005 seemed to change how we could give out literature slightly, because it said that a person commits an offence if they distribute printed matter without the consent of the principal litter authority. And some Christians got into trouble over this. However, Section 1, Part 4b says that it doesn't apply where the distribution is for the purposes of religion. And so therefore, if we're giving out gospel leaflets, then actually we don't come under this legislation, and so therefore can't come under the need to have consent from the principal litter authority in that area. And actually the advice that's been given to Christians is that actually if you're trying to stop from giving out literature under this, then actually you should ask for a written apology and confirmation that Section 1.4 will be brought to the attention of other police officers and council officials so that other Christians don't face problems in the future. So I just want to come back briefly to the police. If you do get stopped by the police, what I encourage you to do is be sensible. They're not trying to cause you problems, but they're just trying to keep the peace in a way that they feel is the most effective. I would encourage you that if the police ask you to stop, don't argue with them, but just calmly ask them why. Can you explain to me what the problem is? Is there a way that we can rectify that problem which would allow me to continue to preach in this place? Explain to them your understanding of the law, and if they say that you need permission because of the area it is, ask them if they know where you can get permission from, and if they can suggest a better place for you to go and preach so that you can continue sharing the gospel out on the streets. I encourage you that if you are kind and courteous and respectful to the police, then they will respond in a much better manner to you than if you try to attack them from the moment that they arrive and try to speak to you. My final thoughts then when it comes to the law relating to street evangelism is that you do not need permission to preach on a public street. And so if you think it's a public street, then preach. Preach and declare the gospel. Go and share the good news of Jesus Christ so that those that otherwise may never get a chance to hear it will hear and hopefully respond. Finally, I just want to point you towards some good resources that can help you a little bit more about this. I've put links to these in the description below so that you can find all of these. Both of these go into more detail than I've been able to in this video. We hope that this has helped you understand a bit more about your rights and freedoms when it comes to preaching in the open air. And I hope that you were able to go out and proclaim the good news of Jesus and see a great many people turn and put their trust in Christ.